Welcome to the Edgar Rice Burroughs mini podcast, episode number 10. My name is Tim DeForest. I'm the author of several books about what I refer to as pre-digital pop culture, things like pulp magazines, old-time radio, and such. These mini podcasts are to supplement the full-length podcasts I do with Jess Terrell and Scott Stewart, in which we usually talk in depth about a specific work of Edgar Rice Burroughs. In the mini podcast, currently, we are going chapter by chapter through the 1912 novel Tarzan of the Apes, the novel that introduced us to the Lord of the Jungle, analyzing each chapter and talking about what makes it work as a great adventure story. Now, I will be including spoilers as I talk about the novel, both spoilers involving this novel and sometimes spoilers involving later novels in the series. So please be aware of that, though I'm sure most of you listening to this are listening to it because you are fans of ERB's work and you're already familiar with the novels I'm talking about. I would also suggest that you go back and take a few minutes to read Chapter 2 before you listen to this podcast to refamiliarize yourself with it, because I will be presuming that you are familiar with the events of the chapter as I talk about them. Now, Chapter 2 is titled The Savage Home, and it brings us to the setting in which the bulk of the story will take place, a section of remote jungle along the west coast of Africa, peopled by many or inhabited by many carnivorous animals, such as lions and panthers, as well as a tribe of apes. At first, John and Alice are the only human beings around. In fact, after they're killed and their son is adopted by the apes, it will be years before any other human beings show up in the area. And we don't meet the apes yet, though they are nicely foreshadowed in one passage towards the end of the chapter. Quote, John, she, being Alice, whispered, what is that, a man? I'm going to start over because I did a horrible job of that. John, she whispered, look, what is it, a man? As Clayton turned his eyes in the direction she indicated, he saw silhouetted dimly against the shadows beyond a great figure standing upright upon the ridge. For a moment it stood as though listening, and then turned slowly and melted into the shadows of the jungle. What is it, John? I do not know, Alice, he answered gravely. It is too dark to see that so far, and it may have been but a shadow cast by the rising moon. No, John. If it was not a man, it was some huge and grotesque mockery of a man. Oh, I am afraid. Burroughs' descriptive prose is strong throughout this chapter. From the moment the Claytons are brought ashore, we are vividly aware that they are in an isolated, lonely environment full of deadly dangers. It's an amazing example of Burroughs' imagination. He knew little about the real Africa. In fact, when this novel was first published in All Story magazine, the jungle included tigers, because Burroughs didn't know tigers weren't native to the continent. The tigers were changed into lionesses in later reprints. So he's essentially creating a fantasy world, a world based on a popular culture view of Africa as taken in 1912, inhabited by a species of apes unknown to the real world. In fact, as we begin to encounter the apes in later chapters, we'll see just how skilled Burroughs is at world building, creating a fantasy environment that had a strong internal logic, a world that we can believe actually exists. Now we see the last of the mutinous crew in this chapter. We know wreckage of the ship was later found, and we get a strong hint here of why it wrecked when Black Michael tells John, when I get safely hid away, I'll see to it that the British government learns where ye be. For the life of me, I couldn't tell them exactly, for I don't know myself. Obviously, the crew didn't have anybody left aboard after they killed the officers who knew how to navigate. It's really no wonder the ship was somehow wrecked soon afterwards. Now, both our sympathies and the sympathies of the Claytons were with the crew, who were brutalized horribly by the now dead officers. Burroughs makes it clear that the crew themselves were no less brutal. The mutiny itself at the beginning of the chapter shows just how vicious they could be, from the bloodthirsty way they cut down the officers to the fact that they simply threw all the wounded overboard afterwards, both officers and their own wounded. There's no reason to doubt Black Michael when he says that he's the only one of the crew who doesn't want to simply kill the Claytons outright. Now, John doubts whether Black Michael will keep his promise to eventually tell the authorities where he left them stranded. It's an interesting question, actually. Certainly, Michael's sense of gratitude is real, because otherwise he would have simply killed them without batting an eye. On the other hand, he obviously leaves the Claytons all their property, including their weapons, in part because he doesn't want to leave any evidence aboard the ship that they were there, protecting himself from at least one of the crimes he says he's had committed. On the other hand, from that, he did leave them rope and other supplies when he didn't have to. So Michael did have some level of humanity in him, and I guess we'll never know if he would have told the authorities about the Claytons. Of course, there's a reason Michael leaves the Claytons all their luggage that will advance the plot in an important way a few chapters from now. There's a storytelling reason for it. So when a young Tarzan begins to use the books that are a part of that luggage to teach himself to read and write a few years down the road. Now, the last thing to mention about chapter 2 is regarding Alice. In the previous chapter, we saw she was both smart and brave. But here, she's in a situation that is testing her fortitude to the limits. We sympathize with her, of course, when she breaks down sobbing, but we can also appreciate her when she pulls herself together and says she'll try to cope. We'll see in the next chapter that in the end, she couldn't cope. But she'll get another moment of incredible bravery before she reaches her limit. In chapter 2, though, Burroughs is hinting that she does indeed have a limit to what she'll be able to handle. So once again, Burroughs, as a storyteller, is effectively setting up future events. Now, John also continues to show courage and to use his head, finding a spot to build a cabin and setting up the treetop hideout as a temporary measure until that cabin is built. In both Alice and John, we continue to see that noble bloodline that will be Tarzan's inheritance. And that's really all I have for chapter 2. In chapter 3, we'll see tragedy, sudden death, and one of the saddest sentences ever written in the history of literature. Well, once again, my name is Tim DeForest. Please visit my blog at Comics, Old Time Radio, and other cool stuff. You'll also find a link to my Amazon.com author page there if you're curious about my books. Keep an ear out for our full-length podcasts. We're able to record one every 2 or 3 months. And as I said earlier, when we do so, we usually look at one of the novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs in depth. We've also done full-length podcasts about the Tarzan on radio, and also looked at one of the Tarzan movies. So you get a wide variety of Burroughs-related subjects on our podcasts. If you do enjoy them, please feel free to leave a review to that effect on iTunes. We understand that does help bring new listeners in. We would love to have more people listening to us. And that's it for now. So we will be back soon with Chapter 3.